In Plato's dialogue Gorgias, Socrates says of the eloquent spin masters of his day that they're good at oratory but bad at conversation. The dialogue is the one in which Socrates tells his incredulous interlocutors that it's better to suffer evil than to do it, an affirmation that lies at the heart of a belief strong in one part of our Western tradition, that at critical points politics and morality are irreconcilably in conflict. In the first part of the dialogue, Socrates is concerned to distinguish philosophy from oratory. Many commentators say that he distinguished them primarily on the grounds that whereas oratory appeals to the emotions, philosophy appeals to reason. There's truth in that, but characteristic ways of taking it set reason and feeling in opposition in ways that I think reflection on conversation should incline us to resist. Socrates thought that oratory betrays a trust intrinsic to conversation, real conversation as we sometimes speak of it when we exclaim joyfully, "At last, someone to talk to." And that's a trust that the person with whom we're speaking will respect one's need to be persuaded legitimately, that she won't exploit our vulnerability to, for example, sentimentality or pathos or other fears. And for that reason, Socrates condemned what oratory, not as a morally neutral skill to good or bad ends, but he thought it was, as we do, spin, rotten through and through. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about in these lectures is discussed in philosophy under the notion of public reason. In later lectures, I'll locate what I have to say in relation to that notion. But I'm going to begin my discussion on these difficult matters by reflecting on something very interesting that happened in Melbourne some years ago. And reflection on it will take me to the heart of my topic, or to matters that are at the heart of my topic. Mirko Bagaric, who was professor and is professor, I think, and Dean of Law at Deakin University, published in the early 2000s, in The Age, a version of an article he'd written for an undergraduate law journal in the States. In both, he argued that international law prohibiting torture in all circumstances should be relaxed when there's good reason to believe that torturing somebody might save perhaps thousands of lives. But in his newspaper article, he wrote more aggressively and with undisguised contempt for the traditions that had informed the prohibition in international law. In the eyes of some people, he made matters worse by praising torture as, quote, an excellent information gathering device. More than his failure to acknowledge the evidence that suggests that torture is not a reliable means of getting information, it was his tone that offended many people. In what follows today and in later lectures, I won't discuss whether torture is ever morally, legally, or politically justifiable, although if I have time, I will explain why I believe that what justification comes to or fails to come to will be different in each of these realms of value. I'm interested in what the way in which Bagaric put his case and what some of the responses to it show about the constraints and possibilities in what I'm going to call the conversation of citizens. Bagaric's article provoked many letters of outrage to the editor. Some of his colleagues wrote saying that they were ashamed to be in the same faculty, even in the same university with him. Some called on him to resign and on the Vice-Chancellor to sack him if he didn't. She resisted, wisely to my mind. Perhaps she realised what those who demanded his sacking or protested that he'd shamed the law faculty and the university seemed not to realise, namely that the essence of his position is espoused, usually less offensively and more elegantly, by many philosophers. Many philosophers who oppose torture in all circumstances believe there is a case for it, and rightly believe that they're duty-bound to put that case justly to their students. Because of the attractions of that case, many of their students are persuaded by it. Some of those students must have noted that a university teacher who rises to the virtually ubiquitous call on academics to be public intellectuals, or to have impact, as it's now put in the UK, and who professes publicly a consequentialist justification of torture, or perhaps indeed any justification of torture, risked becoming a pariah. What are they to think? Well, there is, to be sure, often something disturbing and sometimes distasteful about public expressions of outrage. Bagaric received hate mail and threatening phone calls. But there can be also something disturbing and sometimes distasteful about the kind of urbanity that always condescends to outrage. In the Bagaric affair, as I'll refer to it now from now on, there was a fair amount of the former but little of the latter. Surprisingly, I thought. As far as I know, there was none from philosophers who were publicly silent on the question. I don't know why they were silent. I hope it was because they were made thoughtfully aware that even philosophers might justifiably be answerable for the moral positions they profess or advocate as worth serious consideration. That raises the question, of course, answerable to whom and as what? As philosophers, or only as academic philosophers? As human beings, or only as citizens? If all of these things, then what's the relation between them? The importance of these questions is one reason why I find the Bagaric affair so interesting, and I hope that I'll go some way towards answering some of those questions by the end of this series. Earlier, I remarked that many people were incredulous that talk of torture was again on the agenda, as some of them put it. Though they often lamented that we seem morally to be going backwards, I doubt that many of them believed that it had, in any substantive sense, been established that we ought never to torture people. Not at any rate established as factual matters or theoretical matters can be established. And though they often mixed expressions of revulsion at once, what many of them called the intrinsic evil of torture, with arguments about the bad consequences, including the bad moral consequences on our institutions of allowing torture to become a practice, the tone of their incredulity was not informed by their beliefs about the consequences of abandoning the absolute prohibition of torture as that now stands in international law. Thinking about them, I was reminded of the complaint made by the philosopher Stuart Hampshire against what he believed to be the destructive impact of consequentialism on our moral sensibility. Hampshire wrote of how consequentialists distort, trivialise, and often ridicule, and now I quote, epithets usually associated with morally impossible action, on a sense of disgrace, of outrage, of horror, of baseness, of brutality, and most important, a sense that a barrier assumed to be firm and almost insurmountable has been knocked over, and a feeling that if this horrible or outrageous or squalid or brutal action is possible, then anything is possible, and nothing is forbidden, and all restraints are threatened. I should perhaps at this point say that consequentialists are not at all alone amongst moral theorists who might be vulnerable to Hampshire's criticism. I doubt that most deontological theorists would escape unscathed, so it's not really about consequentialism. I suspect that many of the people whose incredulity I reported would have thought that Hampshire captured its moral tone, though of course some of them might not accept the whole of it. The last part of what I quoted, for example, the part that expresses the fear that anything is possible, that nothing is forbidden, and that all restraints are threatened, might strike some of them as hysterical. But insofar as Hampshire captures not just their shock and outrage, but also their incredulity, then he captures part of the idea that some things are unthinkable and undiscussable for individuals and for cultures. Bagaric responded to the outrage by saying that his critics had allowed emotion to overtake their reason, and that to legitimate that failing by suggesting that some things are undiscussable is a further and worse betrayal of reason. He was also indignant that people could, as he saw it, capitulate so irresponsibly to the forces of unreason, and to do it with such sanctimonious high-mindedness when possibly thousands of lives were at stake. None of that is surprising. Anybody who has heard philosophical arguments between consequentialists and deontologists will be familiar with accusations that only somebody preciously concerned with his or her integrity, or as Jonathan Glover once put it, who had a possessive attitude to their virtue, could refuse to do something when the refusal was, that refusal had terrible consequences. Glover, by the way, now regrets the use of that expression. But after September 11th, Bagaric rightly noted, the argument was no longer just hypothetical. Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard academic lawyer, had some years earlier argued much the same as Bagaric. He did it with more intellectual sophistication, but at critical points his tone was no more impressive. Attempting to call people to sobriety against what he took to be their intoxication by a moral absolutism that had no real or imaginative contact with its consequences, he felt obliged to convince them that he fully understood how terrible it is to torture somebody and how terrible it is to suffer torture. Normatively, he's against torture, he assured them. Defending himself against the accusation that his were morally dangerous thought experiments, he replied that it was his obligation as a professor to be prepared to think anything. Presumably, he thought it to be an obligation that fell on professors by virtue of their role in secular universities. Perhaps he would not think it fell on professors in Catholic universities, for example. But then he might also have thought that insofar as that obligation does not fall on them, then the idea of a Catholic university is a contradiction in terms. Opposed to the ideal that professors should be prepared to think anything, that they should follow reason wherever it took them, no matter how morally terrible the destination, is, of course, opposed to that, of course, is the idea that I suggested was implicit in the response of at least many of the people who were incredulous that torture should again be up for discussion, and was pretty much explicit in Hampshire's criticism of consequentialism. It is the idea that some things should be morally unthinkable and also undiscussable. Were the idea of the morally unthinkable anathema only to consequentialists, it might not be worth much discussion. But it's an affront to many people who are not consequentialists and who believe it is the expression of dogma, the abdication of reason, the justification of intolerance, and therefore politically dangerous. They acknowledge, of course, that some matters have been established, some obviously true, and so on. But they think, nonetheless, that nothing should be unthinkable, especially in morality, whose historical development, they will say, is in large part a function of the rejection of the dogma implicit in the idea that some things ought to be morally unthinkable. Well, open-mindedness is, I take it, self-evidently, generally a virtue. But there are, I suggest, things about which we do not have an open mind. Not so much because it would betray a serious failure of judgment, not because it betrays an intellectual failing in the way, for example, it betrays an intellectual failing to be open to flat earthers, but because one should fear to be the kind of person who believes them and takes them into her life. And though it would be a mistake to think that what is undiscussable in a culture is just what is morally unthinkable for individuals writ large and made public, as it were, Nonetheless, just as you can tell what kind of person somebody is partly by what she finds morally unthinkable, so you can tell the essential character of a culture, even a nation, by noting what is undiscussable in it. Nations and their political and moral cultures are partly defined by what is undiscussable in them. And by undiscussable, I mean that though one knows in the abstract, as it were, that there is a case for castrating sex offenders publicly on the grounds that it might act as a deterrent, it's not treated seriously as a case. It's a case, so to speak, in inverted commas only. What's treated as undiscussable is treated as having no serious speaking voice in an argument, as something that no one should rightly believe she must listen to with an open mind, allowing herself to be persuaded by it if the argument goes a certain way. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, the public castration of sex offenders, cutting off the hands and perhaps other limbs to punish certain kinds of offenders, stoning women to death for adultery. All these and more are undiscussable for us. In later lectures, by the way, I'll talk a lot about what we and for us and our come to, but for this lecture I will leave it unremarked upon. We don't allow that argument over these things genuinely has two sides, just as we do not allow that there are two sides for the proposition that in order to compete with cheap Asian labour, we should enslave our black citizens, or for the proposition that Israeli injustices against the Palestinians suggest that Hitler got at least one thing right. We seem, therefore, to be ambivalent about the virtue of finding nothing unthinkable. And to reduce the tension in that ambivalence, I want now to try to explain why I think it's not always the expression of dogma to regard some things as or a dogmatic disposition of mind to think of some things as morally unthinkable. An example will help, I hope. In the early 1990s, a man in London, brandishing a knife, demanded money of a young mother who was wheeling her baby. He threatened to mutilate the baby if she refused. She gave him her purse and her jewellery. He then slashed the baby's face and body and ran off. The baby died in hospital, and his mother was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. I sometimes told that story to students when I was teaching in London who professed to be sceptical about whether the concept of the morally terrible answers to anything real, as almost all students do in their first year of philosophy and later. I asked them in those tutorials, these were small tutorials, by the way, 4 people at the most, not like tutorials here, so 4 people. I asked them to put aside for the moment worries about freedom of the will, about cultural conditioning, about who has the right to judge, and other worries of that kind that fuel their scepticism. I asked them for the moment they don't argue as devil's advocate, nor argue about what someone could say or might say, and so on. My wish, I said, is for them to say only what they can say in reflective, considered seriousness in response to these questions. Will they deny, or even express a doubt, that the man who acted in the way I had described had done something morally terrible to the mother and her baby? Will they say that perhaps that there is nothing that seriously answers to the concept of the morally terrible, that it's a concept for which we have no real use, or that it's an illusion generated as an instrument of social control, and so on? Sadly, there's no shortage of examples to use for such purposes, and I've been asking my students such questions for over 30 years. In that time, only one expressed scepticism of the kind that I've been describing that was both sincere and serious, but it was clear, hair-raisingly clear, that it had no intellectual origins. And it wouldn't be much of an exaggeration, if an exaggeration at all, to say that in each tutorial in those 30 years or more, most students professed a form of that nihilistic type of skepticism. Well, argument that what the baby slasher did is morally terrible, agreement that what the baby slasher did is morally terrible, as that agreement always transpired in these tutorials, is not just agreement about how to use a phrase, or merely an agreement on certain paradigms of judgment, whose acceptance is a condition of other, more controversial or speculative judgments. Such agreements are, of course, important, but the realization common to the students and to me that we could not deny or doubt the evil of what the baby's murderer did was a realization that much more than error or muddle or even incoherence was at stake here. The fear of thinking that perhaps the concept of the morally terrible is empty is not like the fear of thinking that the earth is flat, or the fear of becoming like the person in the joke, that is someone whose mind was so open that his brain fell through. Or another version of it, he uses to praise someone for an open mind, open at one end, open at the, at the other. It's not the fear of becoming someone like that who radically lacks the capacity for sound judgment. It's a moral fear of becoming the kind of person who has such doubts. I suspect that the primary reason why many people are suspicious or even hostile to the idea that a really critical thinker should fear to think the unthinkable is because they take the fear of thinking something always to be an impediment to understanding or to the pursuit of inquiry. In Good and Evil in an Absolute Conception and later in A Common Humanity, I argued that the fear of thinking oneself to a morally horrible conclusion, to the extent that it's even possible, to the extent that it's just thought that could take one there, is quite unlike the fear that a thinker confronts when she approaches a conclusion that will overturn a pet theory or is in other ways psychologically painful to accept. In this latter case, if she were painfully to embrace the conclusion to which she believes that reason compels her, she would show, indeed, admirable fearlessness, because in such cases, fear is a purely external impediment to inquiry and a purely external to the content of the inquiry. But the fear of reaching a morally horrible conclusion, the fear of becoming the kind of person who has seriously embraced it and taken it into her life, that, I've suggested, is inseparable from, indeed is partly constitutive of, what it is to be a morally serious thinker, morally serious as a thinker. Here, moral commitment is not one thing, and a commitment to truth and understanding or to reason another. Being morally committed person, one thing, and being a real thinker another. Kierkegaard put the point nicely in an epigram. Just as a logician most fears a fallacy, he said, so an ethical thinker most fears to fall away from the ethical. Fear of committing a fallacy is part of what makes someone a logician. Fear of falling away from the ethical is what makes someone a serious ethical thinker, was his point. And if that is so, the idea that a thinker, by virtue of being really a thinker, a true thinker, should fear to think nothing, looks to be edifying fantasy. Unless a person is a morally serious thinker, we have no reason to trust her conclusions, no reason to walk with her on the way to them. If she's a morally serious thinker, someone whose seriousness is shaped by her understanding of her subject matter, then she'll be fearless in the face of some conclusions and fearful in the face of others. She'll treat some things as beyond consideration, because to do that is to exercise rightly the qualities of mind, the qualities of sensibility that are necessary for serious moral reflection. Nothing, of course, guarantees she'll be right. Nothing, I really want to emphasize, nothing can guarantee that she'll rule things out of consideration only because she's a bigot. People have feared to think that slavery is an injustice and that black and white people should be lovers. The list of morally terrible things that have been self-righteously defended by appeal to the morally unthinkable is sadly very long. But so, of course, is the list of errors that have been defended in the name of knowledge and certainty. And just as the latter should not tempt us to jettison the concepts of knowledge and certainty, so the bigotry that is often betrayed in appeals to the unthinkable and the undiscussable should not tempt us to think that understanding and truth would be better served if we jettison those concepts. Truth is served only by the understanding, and understanding is served only when we attend closely to the critical concepts that determine its forms. This, I think, is critical to understanding the kind of impossibility that my students discovered in the course of our discussion. I would rather put it that way, that is to say, the kind of impossibility that they discovered, rather than to say the certainty that they discovered when they realised they couldn't deny that what the baby slasher had done was morally terrible. Once they realised that, the students were no longer inclined to say, as they had earlier, that their incapacity to doubt in such cases was merely the psychological consequence of effective social conditioning, the expression of taboos so deeply internalised that they couldn't even contemplate their critical examination. To acknowledge that our beliefs are socially conditioned or that our certainty is merely a psychological phenomenon is to acknowledge that we should at least try to step back from those beliefs in order to reassess them. And that, of course, is likely to be difficult, and when they're deeply entrenched, it may even prove impossible. But one can't know that it's impossible unless one seriously tries and fails to step back from those beliefs. But when one realises the fear of a nihilistic moral scepticism is inseparable from a sober understanding of it, of what it comes to, then when one realises that one can't even try to be open to such scepticism, then one also realises that the impossibility of adopting a sceptical stance in this case is of a different kind from the impossibilities whose nature can be explained by elaboration of the power of social and psychological forces. To suggest that the person who cannot be open to nihilistic scepticism should perhaps try to be open to it would be to misunderstand the kind of impossibility that he expresses or she expresses, just as one would misunderstand the impossibility that Luther expressed when he said famously, "Here I stand, I can do no other," if one were to say to him, "Come on, why don't you try? It might not be so hard. Why not take therapy?" To say that you're no longer so anally obsessed by your principles. Well, did I get such a response over so many years because I bullied my students with a catalogue of horrors? Given the nature of nihilistic scepticism, for that's what the radical denial of this sort of thing comes to, it's natural to voice that suspicion. The responses of my students are in keeping, however, with an astonishing fact about our philosophical tradition. Although professions of nihilism haunt it, as they do contemporary intellectual culture more generally these days, there is virtually no philosopher in the mainstream, and I do not exclude Nietzsche, who has seriously professed such scepticism in the first person. It's usually attributed to somebody else for the sake of an argument, or, as in Plato's dialogues, to characters whose intellectual seriousness and stamina are inadequate to the rigours of argument. Like the cynicus, for example, they sulk and run off as soon as the argument gets tough. It's therefore not necessarily a dogmatic refusal to be open to persuasion about some of those moral matters, nor is it just a sign of decency. It's a criterion of moral seriousness, I wanted to suggest. I would suggest it's a conceptual truth that we concern merely by reflecting on a particular, now this is an important qualification, on a particular conception of moral value, that a person must take seriously the moral values that she professes. To refuse to be open to some moral views is intrinsic to the kind of seriousness that defines that concept of morality and distinguishes from its perspective moral value from other kinds of value. And for that reason, one should distinguish what a person finds morally undiscussable, because she finds it morally impossible to think through the thing, from what she believes passionately, perhaps even dogmatically. In the latter case, she may also not be open to persuasion when she's just thinking passionately or dogmatically. She may be brought to see that she ought to be open to argument and that only psychological obstacles stand in the way of it. But someone who believes something is undiscussable and someone who thinks it's discussable stand in a different relation to one another than people with strong opposing moral convictions. It's an important question how one can tell whether one has come to believe something that one had previously thought to be morally unthinkable because one has travelled a path lit by reason, or is it because one has fallen away from the perspective from which it rightly appeared unthinkable? In the worst case, one will fear that one's sensibility has become corrupted. And matters are made worse by the fact that if one takes seriously the idea of fearing to think the unthinkable, then it seems that a person who is possessed by that fear and who tries to determine whether she is right to be fearful is rather like a person whose mind has been lost to madness and who tries to use her mind to determine whether or not she is mad. When the Nazis dominated Europe, some people must have been tempted to draw the conclusion that the Jews deserved what was being done to them, while knowing fully what was being done to them. Some of them, I assume, must have become terrified by the conclusion to which they were being drawn. I say being drawn rather than driven because I believe nobody with any moral imagination or logical acumen is compelled by reason to a morally abhorrent conclusion, gritting her teeth all the way to it. Always, in anything that counts as serious moral thought, there are so many complexities, so many controversial premises, that one can escape such horrible conclusions with a perfectly clear intellectual conscience. Well, it's true and important, though, what one person or culture finds unthinkable, another finds thinkable, even practices it. And sometimes a person who finds something unthinkable will not be able to find their feet with those who don't. Sometimes she will. I think, or at least I hope, that it is no part of the conception of the unthinkable that I wish to defend, that a person who finds something morally unthinkable must look upon those who find it thinkable, or even those who seriously profess it as their belief, as wicked, let alone as moral monsters. But as I've suggested, it's part of that conception of the unthinkable that I've tried to elaborate, that she must take seriously the idea of a corrupted sensibility, and that sometimes when she begins to find thinkable what she had previously thought to be unthinkable, she must fear that it's because her sensibility has become corrupted. The humility required to acknowledge that this could happen to anybody prevents the concept of the morally unthinkable from being one that is necessarily judgmental, applied only by people who are moralistic in the pejorative sense of that term. Strange though it may sound, to believe that someone has a corrupted sensibility is not thereby to be judgmental in the sense that implies taking unsavoury pleasure in pointing fingers at people so that others may turn their back on them. Nor will it be condescending if the person who believes another to have a corrupted sensibility also realises just how fragile is our understanding of good and evil, virtue and vice. Perhaps, though, what I'm saying belongs to a conception of morality whose intensity is increasingly alien to us, perhaps even distasteful for us, now that we are so inclined to admire, perhaps above all, a cool urbanity. I've been speaking, and this is a qualification I signalled before. I've been speaking as though the idea of the morally unthinkable is intrinsic to moral seriousness. But now I must stress the qualification that it belongs to one historically important conception of morality, but that's not the only conception of morality. We disagree, and I don't mean only philosophers, not only about what morally to do, but also about what it is for something to be of serious moral concern, the kind of place it can have in a life, and its distinctive kind of seriousness. And clearly there are conceptions of the nature of morality that find the idea of the morally unthinkable to be alien to what they take moral seriousness to come to. Intrinsic to their conception of moral seriousness is the idea that a morally serious person will, to the extent that is in her power, be obedient to the claims of reason, which on this conception require them to reject the very idea that she should fear to think some things. Morality, she will say, cannot be at odds with truth and understanding. And to care for truth and understanding, really to care for them, is to follow reason fearlessly wherever it takes one. Well, obviously, I have to attend to this more closely than I have. But to discuss it, I'll prefigure something that I'm going to, or that'll be the basis of next week's lecture. It shouldn't be controversial, and I'll go back to Bagaric, because this is, what I'm about to say is, I think, the most interesting lesson of his example. It shouldn't be controversial that Bagaric betrayed impressive deafness to moral tone when he described torture as an excellent information-gathering device. But such criticism of his tone misses, I think, what is most interesting in Bagaric's use of that offending expression, that torture is an excellent information-gathering device. I'm almost certain that he didn't choose it to offer a euphemistic description of torture, deliberately to hide its moral reality, in the way that people do when, for example, they describe the killing of civilians as collateral damage. Under the influence of a distinction between head and heart, thought and feeling, that goes deep in philosophy and the culture more generally, he believed, I think, that the description that he hit upon is of the kind necessary for understanding, the kind that cuts away layers of irrelevant association, irrelevant tone, irrelevant style, and so on, to reveal what is really at issue. The idea here is to represent a certain conception of objectivity. And the idea is not that one should try to strike the right tone. It is that one should try to get tone out of one's work altogether, if one can. The point applies to style more generally. It's the idea, and indeed the expression of an ideal, that someone who seeks understanding and truth, properly understood, must always seek to extract content suited to the faculty of understanding from the style in which it has been presented, from the literary quality of the sentences in which it has been presented, from the tone of voice in which it was presented, from the aesthetic quality of the images in which it was presented, and so on. Style conceived this way is adornment. It's sometimes pleasing, sometimes irritating, but generally it's dangerous to thought because on this conception it too often appeals to the heart rather than to the head. And when controversy is bitter, it tends to hit below the intellectual belt. That is the ideal, to try to the extent that is humanly possible to put anything that is genuinely cognitive, genuinely a matter for the understanding, in a form to which the objection that it's sentimental or cliched, or shows a tinea for irony, or that it's offensive in its tone, would be as inappropriate as it would be to lodge such an objection against a proposition in physics or mathematics. Real thought, thought directed at understanding, according to this way of thinking, about what it is to be obedient to the claims of reason and to be rational, strives to exist in a tone-free zone. And that is what I'm going to talk about next week.
I can imagine myself in New York in 8/11, and I can imagine that I've got a terrorist in the room next door who can stop this event taking place. And I'm wondering whether there's a question that could be asked, which is, look here, what kind of torture might be effective? In the sense that, could I use a truth serum? Could I keep this bloke awake all night? Is this a more benign way of approaching this situation? My children are there, thousands are going to be murdered. And I wondered when you were talking whether you hadn't, gone into the unpacking the notion of, or the concept of torture.
Well, I had. In fact, one of the reasons that I use the Bagaric example, apart from the fact that I think it so interestingly brought up questions that I want to talk about. That is, what kinds of responsibilities academics have. Is it proper to feel ashamed of one's colleague for expressing, let's say, for supporting torture, or is that completely inappropriate in an academic context, and other things like the undiscussable. One of the reasons is that it's on my mind because I'm finishing a book of my own essays whose provisional title will be On Dignity. And some years ago, in fact, around the time that Bagaric was saying this, and at the time that torture was being discussed because of September 11th, I was writing a book on torture. At first, because I belonged to that group of people that were shocked that it could be discussed again. But once I'd written a couple of pieces expressing that shock in newspapers and so on, I was much more interested in the philosophical issues that underpinned all this, what kind of shock it was, I mean, as I've been discussing today. And strangely, I then felt, I know this might sound ridiculous, but I was within 3 weeks of handing the manuscript to my publisher, and I stopped, to his great chagrin, because he'd already advertised the book on Amazon. Because I felt sort of indecent taking this intellectual pleasure in this topic, as it was now becoming, as I was beginning to think about the idea of dignity, for example, because it was that concept, dignity with a big D, as it appears when people talk about the dignity of humanity and so on. It was a concept that was constantly appealed to by people who opposed torture because they thought it's the only concept that can properly characterize the kind of violation that torture can be, even if you think it should be done. Yeah, I did think about that, but as I said, that's not something that's in this series of lectures.
Do you think that there's a difference between cutting off someone's arm and giving them a truth serum?
Yeah, of course there's a difference, and but nobody was talking about just giving people truth serums. And the kinds of things that were in fact contemplated were not that. I mean, there were water. Not only which particular things, like waterboarding, hooding, loud noises, making people stand. They're always used in conjunction. And you might think that making someone stand for a very long time, like Shaney said, who cares about that? I stand all the time. But very soon in those positions, within about 7 or 8 hours, your liver starts to pack up, your kidneys start to pack up. So these are not, but of course there are going to be differences and gradations. And the person I referred to, Dershowitz, was specifically arguing for what he called non-lethal forms of it, based, by the way, on practices that the Israelis had made legal. And then the Israeli court, in 1999, the High Court rendered illegal again. So, of course, and there's going to be always the grisly business of where you draw a line, what's torture, what's not.
Now, I would just like to interrogate this concept of the unthinkable, morally unthinkable, and at some stage you use the word impossibility to sort of describe the unthinkability of it all. So I'm just wondering, the unthinkability, is it something that is cognitively impossible to think, that there are certain ideas to a person that is just cognitively impossible to grasp? Is it that sort of impossibility that you have in mind, or is it more a normative impossibility, that one holds the view that one should not think certain things in a more normative sense than a cognitive?
Yes, well, it's not the I mean, one can certainly think the proposition. In fact, I was been thinking about all those propositions. So it's not as though the proposition can't appear in your head and you reflect upon it in all sorts of ways. The difficulty is in the examples I was making or citing a moral impossibility, not just any old normative impossibility. And I distinguish the kind of impossibility it is from the thought that one should not think. I mean these modal expressions are difficult, but that's why it's much like when the impossibility is the kind that someone expresses. I mean, as a modality, it's the kind that someone expresses when someone says, "I can't walk past this person injured here on the road." Right? And when someone expresses that sense of impossibility, it would be completely wrong for anybody who saw, to say, "It's not so hard, you know, I'll put your hands over your eyes, I'll help you. We're late to the theatre, you know, someone else will help you," and so on. And that would be a misunderstanding. But also, it seems to me that when someone says, in this kind of case, morally, but they're not going to say morally, they say, "Look, I can't," right? And then, in elaboration, might say something like, "Can't you see what it means for this person to be lying there, unattended, etc.?" Then that looks to be an act of compassion. Interestingly, a morally necessitated act of compassion, because the modality that expresses is the modality of impossibility. But in that respect, it would be different from somebody who said, "Look, I have an obligation," whose response was whose response was not such that one would be, for the minute, inclined to say it was the expression of compassion, but genuinely it would be the recognition of an obligation that he had to stop and help this person. So yes, it's normative, but it's not any old normative. After all, logic is a normative discipline. And it's the impossibility, in the example of my students, it was the impossibility they expressed, "No, we can't doubt this. We can't doubt that this is a morally terrible thing." And at first they wanted to say, "That's just because we've been so conditioned." Yeah? And the reason I went through this so often, because every time you start a moral philosophy class, that morality is just this, morality is just that, it's merely this, it's merely that. And so I had to say, well, look, let's take this example. And when every time they acknowledged that they couldn't, in the sense of couldn't that I've been explaining, doubt that this was a morally terrible thing, then I would say, now we've got to this point of sobriety, where it's not just talk. Anybody can say, maybe this, maybe that. But now we know that we can't. Now we can talk about objectivity, truth, skepticism, etc. But we start from this starting point. And if at the end of the day you want to say, hey, I'm no longer where I was in that first tutorial when I admitted that, well, that's another matter.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much. Really very stimulating, thought-provoking talk. I take your point about what you were looking at was the way people protested and said this is morally unthinkable, it should be undiscussable, topic is closed. But it seems to me that there was, at the time, another stream of criticism, and that was based on what you said about tone. If you strip the tone and the style away, then his basic premise was that torture was an excellent information gathering device. As soon as you say that that's his premise, you can query the reality, the objectivity, the truth of that premise. And it did seem to me that some of the objections from his colleagues were based on what they seemed to think was a dishonest misuse of a highly falsifiable and false premise to create to take a public stance and to a certain extent to create a public presence for himself. It seems to me that's a quite different sort of argument.
Do you mean because there's plenty of reason to think that torture is not a good way of getting information?
Well, there's certainly not much evidence to support that premise being taken as axiomatic.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not axiomatic.
No. Well, I know there's a lot of discussion about that, but as I read it, and if I don't want to place too much emphasis on my being wrong about this, but right about it. But as I read some of the objection was not to the fact that he had so blatantly disregarded the fact that, to say the least, there's a lot of controversy about whether, but there was something about that tone, that you could speak in that tone, that shocked them. And I found that very, very, very interesting, and indeed it's something that I want to focus on. As for generally the idea of the unthinkable, actually, one of the things I realised when I was writing these lectures is that I haven't given enough thought to the difference between some things being morally unthinkable for a person and some things being undiscussable in a culture. Although I think there's a sense in, as I said in my lecture, one can tell what kind of person someone is by what is unthinkable for her and what kind of culture one's in what's unthinkable for that culture. I mean, that I think is true. And I want to say it's an interesting fact that we don't treat as a case with two sides to be put for it, that we should castrate male sex offenders in public in order to. We don't. That's not an option for us. Or to take a far less dramatic thing, it's a feature of our culture that we don't think there's a case for assassination, political assassination. That's not for us an option. To live in a culture where it's not an option is different from living in a culture where they have discussed it and thought it could be an option, but have rejected it on the grounds that, all things considered, it's far better not to have assassinations. I think these are different.
Can I ask you, perhaps for next week, it seems to me, sorry, another example that I'd be interested in hearing what you say about it, just leaving this one aside, is Peter Singer's statement that in some cases the lives of animals and the well-being of animals is more important than the lives of very deformed, intellectually impaired people. And that seemed to cause a lot of outrage too. To me, it's entirely morally thinkable that that could be the case. And he didn't decide. That might be a different way of distinguishing between what's morally thinkable or unthinkable and what's culturally discussable.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt whatsoever that people express themselves as finding unthinkable what some other people think not only to be thinkable but right. That's just a fact. And people come to find what they have found unthinkable later on. They agree. Gay marriage is a really interesting case, it seems to me. There are people who would have said, would have been utterly incredulous, right, about the that there should be gay marriage, and then come to agree. But what I'm interested in is whether these kinds of cases are reasons for thinking that it's just hyperbole to say that something is unthinkable, right? And therefore that there's no serious place in our understanding of the concepts that should be fundamental to a conception of critical inquiry, no place amongst those concepts for the concepts of the unthinkable. And that indeed is the standard position. The standard position is just to say, well, when you say it's unthinkable, you're just saying, oh my God, how terrible, right? And then someone might say, I don't think it's so terrible. So let's think, let's talk, let's discuss. Don't be so dogmatic, and so on. This is pretty much the standard view about the concept of the unthinkable. I think it's partly the standard view because it's a kind of instinctive view about which there hasn't been much thought. I mean, it's one of my lamentations, so to speak, about philosophers, my philosophical colleagues, who insist on thinking about thinking, that one of the things they haven't thought about is the role that the concept of the unthinkable might have to play. There's just the instinctive thought that no serious philosopher could possibly take seriously the idea of the unthinkable. So I'm suggesting that there are some various reasons for this, and one big reason is that the models they have in mind when they think of the fear of thinking something are things like someone who's afraid to think something because it's painful, right? Or because it overturns certain pet theories, or because, for example, the belief that it has been so fundamental to their identity. Right? In all those cases, I mean, there are such fears. And in all such cases, when the fear is of that kind, extrinsic to the cognitive content of what is under discussion, then one can say, look, I understand this goes deep with you, and etc., and your parents have thought this, but let's now try to examine it. The let's try move is appropriate. You say it's not impossible, it's the wrong kind of impossibility. But what I've been suggesting is that the fear of the morally unthinkable is intrinsic to the very concept of moral seriousness. It's not an external impediment in the way that fear of thinking a painful conclusion or a pet theory or etc. So but characteristically, the fear of thinking the morally unthinkable, or the fear of becoming the kind of person who takes seriously that such and such, right, is characteristically assimilated to the fear of having a pet theory. I mean, a pet theory makes it trivial. The fear of something that's been utterly fundamental to one's sense of oneself. And I think it's different. Now, I may be wrong about that, but my point is that there hasn't been much discussion of it.
So I wanted to conclude just by asking one question about the example that you were working with that of your students. And I was just curious what you took them to have agreed to, right? Because in one understanding would be that, put in terms of unthinkability, the idea that somebody slashing a baby and driving its mother insane always would count very, very heavily against the act. That's one way of understanding what it means to be morally terrible. And I can see them agreeing to that, and I can sort of see a case of saying that it's sort of unthinkable to not hold that that would count very heavily against an act. But another way of thinking of what they agreed to is that it could never be permissible to do such a thing. And if they're like the students in my tutorials, they probably wouldn't have agreed to that because they could move on to concoct various examples in which the only way of achieving some prevention of some serious atrocity or some greater good would be precisely through slashing a baby's face and driving its mother insane. So I wonder if whether or not unthinkability or undiscussability is going to be something that applies to features which count against an action, or whether all things considered judgments about whether or not anything could be permissible or not.
It's not it certainly wasn't the latter, because it was that particular case that was under discussion, and there wasn't absolutism wasn't the issue. But I wouldn't put it merely as there are very good reasons against it. that the reasons would be reasons of a very distinctive kind, such that it would be remorse that would be appropriate rather than and so on. And, the kind of thing that such that if you did it, you might think you couldn't live with yourself, and so on. I mean, it's not just having a very good reason not to do it, and that's what they. And it's very important that this wasn't. I'm glad you brought this up. It wasn't a case about moral absolutism. That wasn't the example. Nor was it typically a case about whether moral judgments can be objective or not objective. That wasn't really what was at issue. That's why I called it a kind of nihilistic skepticism. It wasn't the skepticism that some people profess when they say there's no such thing, strictly speaking, as moral knowledge. And so. But it's the kind of skepticism that people say, all this talk of morality, it's just power. And that was why I called it a nihilistic kind of skepticism.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the lecture, and look forward to next week.